2, start reading in verse 10. It says, "And the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses. And she said, Because I drew him out of the water. And it came to pass in those days, when Moses was grown, that he went out unto his brethren, and looked on their burden, and he spied an Egyptian smiting an Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian, and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews strove together, and he said to him that did the wrong, Wherefore smitest thou thy fellow? And he said, Who made thee a prince and judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killedst the Egyptian? And Moses feared, and said, Surely this thing is known. Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses, but Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh, and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well." We'll stop there for right now. Let's go ahead and be seated. Moses went through, in his life, went through what could be considered some major difficulties. Some major difficulties in his life. Last week we looked at his birth, and right from the start he's born into a difficult time in the history of the children of Israel. We know that obviously Moses didn't get thrown into the river as the king had commanded, but there's no telling how many boys did. We don't know just how many families were, excited about the fact that she's in labor and their family's about to get started, but it's a boy, and that fear would hit because your child's going to be thrown in a river, going to be killed. And I mean, Moses is born into a difficult time in their history, a tough time in their history, and then we know about him being put in the river, and he then has some years that the Bible tells us basically nothing about. There's very little we hear. Moses' mother is told to nurse the child, and she gives the child to the daughter of Pharaoh. That's where we started, and the next thing we see is Moses is grown. There's nothing in between, but I have to assume that those years were probably interesting, to say the least, for Moses. And I think it would be safe to say were probably tough years, because while he may have personally been growing up in Pharaoh's house, so he had no want for, things, for food or anything like that, he knew he was a Hebrew. And there's no doubt that he saw every day what his people were going through. That he saw what they were dealing with. Can you imagine you're living in luxury, but you're watching your family be afflicted? Watching your family be forced to work by the Egyptians and being beaten, while he may not have personally been put through it. It would have been extremely difficult to enjoy the things that you had and the comforts around you when you knew your family was suffering. Well, that's tough. And then he goes from that, living in the home of Pharaoh, being presumably trained in their schools and having everything that he wants and needs, to where we read tonight that he thinks he's doing something good, and it backfires, and he's left to run in the desert to escape Pharaoh's anger. We are early in Moses' life, and he's already faced some really difficult things, and this may be at the top of his list of problems that he faced, because he went from having everything to having nothing. He went from luxury to poverty. When you think of it, he went from being the grandson of the Pharaoh, living in relative wealth, to being in a desert just sitting next to a well, possessing nothing but the clothes that were on his back. He went from being with family to being all alone. Whether you're talking about his Hebrew family or his Egyptian family. Back home in Egypt, he would, I'm sure, have been had limited exposure to his mom and dad, but at least they were there. At least there was the chance you'd get to see him, and maybe, if you're lucky, you might get to talk to him. We know that he was out where the Hebrews were because he talked to them when they were fighting. So obviously he had access to them. So you went from having that, or whether you're talking about his Egyptian family, while the Pharaoh and the Pharaoh's daughter weren't his blood, they were still the family that raised him. And in a time when they could have just let him die, they chose to take him in and care for him. I have no doubt that Moses would have had feelings for them even if he didn't like what they were doing to his parents. They were still family. I have some family that I don't like the things that they do. We all do. I'm sure every one of us in here has some family member that do some things that you really wish they didn't do. You really wish they didn't. But it doesn't change the fact that they're family and you love them. But whichever family we're talking about here, Moses now has neither. Can you imagine how Moses must have felt? Can you imagine how alone he must have felt? To be perfectly honest, as I was studying for this and thinking about it, I don't know that I can imagine what he was going with, or what he was dealing with. Excuse me. Like anyone else, I've faced difficult things. Probably nothing compared to some in here, but low times. I've given this example in here before. My wife and I went through a stretch of 6 months in which we lost my business, which was our only income, lost our house because of it, had to give my dog away because the place we found didn't allow pets, had a truck repossessed, and lost a baby, all in a 6-month period. I get being in a pretty low place where it just feels like one problem after another, but as I was thinking about it, Moses left everyone he knew also, and while I've had difficult things happen, I've always had support. I've always had my wife beside me the entire time. My parents were always there to build us up and help us through. Moses was sitting at this well alone. I don't know that I can really fully relate to what he's feeling, but even in a super low time where Moses is sitting at the well alone, Moses wasn't alone. God used the exile of Moses. Tonight I have 3 ways that I want us to see God using this exile of Moses, this low time in his life, and God was there. The first I want to see is God led Moses. Moses wasn't, though he thought he was, Moses wasn't wandering aimlessly. It would have felt like that. You're running for your life out of Egypt. It's not as if Moses had this all planned out. Not as if he had an escape route. He was flying by the seat of his pants, or at least so he thought. He thought he was running and just, happened upon this place, but God was leading him through all of it. God led him to a well. Now, just follow me for a moment. But this on its own is a pretty big deal. Remember, we're talking about a man running for his life into a desert. It's what this area is. If he didn't come across water, it's going to be a bad thing really quickly. It's a problem. Last summer, Brother Jansen and David and I did a 3-day hike. And when Brother Jansen and I planned the trip, we planned the entire trip around where we were going to get water. We looked at the maps and we figured out, okay, there's rivers here, there's lakes here. This is where we're going to camp. This is where we're going to stop. Some of those sorts of things, because it's a bad thing if you go very long without water. And we're in the Pacific Northwest where water is plentiful. That's not the case in a desert. So that God led him here was important, but it's more than just that, because God didn't just lead him to a well. It wasn't just any old well. God didn't just pick a water source and say, go this way, Moses. God had a plan. God led him to a well, but also God also led him to a people. Look down at verse 16. Verse 16, it says, "Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. And the shepherds came and drove them away. But Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. And when they came to Reuel, their father, he said, How is it that ye are come so soon today? And they said, An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherd, and also drew water enough for us and watered the flock. And he said unto his daughters, And where is he? Why is it that ye have left the man? Call him, that he may eat bread." And God brings Moses to a well, which by chance is the one that the priest of Midian sends his daughters to. There's no chance in it at all. It was God. The Midianites were descendants of Abraham by his wife Keturah, and they still worshipped the true God. And to top it off, God didn't just lead them to any Midianite, but to the priest's family. Here's what God did. God led him to people who could spiritually help Moses. I may be wrong about this, but like I said, the Bible gives us very little about the childhood of Moses. I realize I'm kind of assuming some of this right now, but we have to assume that Moses would not have had opportunity to have been taught much about God. I'm sure that his mom did when she had him, but that was only while he was nursed, so not very long. And I'm confident that that is not something that he would have been taught in Pharaoh's house. But out in the middle of nowhere, when Moses was all alone, God led him to some godly people, some people who could encourage him, some people who could build him up, but I think more importantly, some people who could teach him. Now, there's just about nothing that helps more when you're in a low place in your life than to get around spiritual people. To surround yourself with some people who not only help you feel better, but more importantly, they'll help you to grow. My parents, when Bo and I were growing up, were always really big on, they taught us to spend the majority of our time not with people who were in the same place as we are, but to spend, whether that's in life or spiritually, but instead they were big on, we spend our time with people who are where we want to be and where we ought to be. Because those people can help us grow. If we spend all our time with people who are right where we are, we're going to stay right where we are. But if we spend our time with people who are where we want to be, where we ought to be, we're going to grow, and that's where God leads Moses. He doesn't lead him to a bunch of other people who are running away for their lives and come to sit at a well. He leads Moses to a people who can help him grow. Leads him to a well. He leads him to a people. He leads Moses to a wife. Look at verse 21 and 22. Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses Zipporah his daughter, and she bare him a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a strange land. Now, my wife is not in here. The Wednesdays that I want my wife in here to hear something, she's in nursery. And the Wednesdays that I think she's going to be in nursery, she's in here. So this one was one I thought, my wife will be in here, and she's in nursery tonight. I actually even asked her before, and she told me that. But this is one of those areas that, as a husband, I could either get myself into a ton of trouble or could earn a lot of brownie points. So this is a brownie point one, so you're welcome to go tattle to her afterwards and help me out here. Follow me on this thought. When going through a time like Moses is going through here, where you feel like you can't get any lower, where maybe you feel like Moses that you're in exile, your spouse can either be the biggest help humanly possible or the biggest hindrance. It's a little brutal, but it's true. I have been extremely blessed. My wife has stayed by my side and supported me through any decision that I've made through the 11 years we've been married. She's been one I've known that even when I make stupid decisions, she's still there. Even when life isn't perfect, it won't change our relationship. But I've known a lot of people, men and women, that can't say that about their spouse. That if they're down, they don't have the support of their spouse. I knew one guy in particular that I worked with who his wife was very much one that if he was down, his wife would kick him while he was down. She'd pile on to whatever it was that he was dealing with this. But here's the difference, and I strongly believe this. If God leads you to your spouse, that won't be the case. I believe that my wife and I have the relationship we do, not because anything that we've done, because if it was anything we've done, I would have messed it up a long time ago, but because God brought us together. That's what we see here, that God brought Moses to his wife. In exile, in his lowest moment, God was leading. Number two, in exile, in Moses' lowest moment, God called. Look over at chapter 3, verse 1. It says, "Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the backside of the desert and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Draw not nigh hither, put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. And skip down to verse 10. It says, Come now, therefore, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Now, as I studied through this, I want to be careful not to get ahead of myself here. But this thought hit me that God could have called Moses to do this while he was still in Egypt. Had God chosen to, he could have, right at that moment, rather than sending Moses into the desert, he could have had him lead them out the same time that he left, but he had a purpose for the desert experience for Moses. And again, I don't want to get ahead of myself. We'll come back to this idea in a bit. But here is Moses, according to chapter 2, content to stay where he is in the wilderness. It tells us that in verse 21, Moses was content to dwell with the man. He's happy where he is, content to go ahead and stay in the wilderness with his wife and raise his kids and his sheep. He moved on from what happened in Egypt. It was, a difficult thing he dealt with, but he made a life for himself here, and he's happy to stay right where he is. But out one day herding those sheep, and he sees a bush on fire, but this bush isn't burning. So that's a little odd. I have to be careful how I say this. I am a fire fan. I like making fires. I like watching fires. But a funny thing about fires, they destroy whatever they're burning. Fires are very, very destructive, but not this one. Not this one. So Moses decides, Moses obviously has seen a few fires himself and says, wait a minute, there's a bush on fire, but it's not burning. I should check this out. And it's here that God, that he's called of God. And real quickly, a few things about this call from God. The first is it's unique. I've already mentioned the fire. This isn't something you see every day. But the fire isn't the only unique thing about the call from God that we see here, though. It's not every day that God audibly calls out to you. But that's what happens to Moses here. This is a unique call. The call was not only unique, the call was specific. God didn't leave room for misunderstanding. He tells Moses, I heard my people. They're crying because they're taskmasters, so I'm sending you to Pharaoh to tell him you're leading them out. Doesn't leave a lot of room for interpretation or for Moses to be confused by this. This is what it is. But that's what God does. When God calls, God has a specific call. He doesn't call us and leave us to figure out, His will on our own. He leads. His call for Moses was unique and it was specific, but it was also not alone. You look down at verse 12, still God talking, and he said, certainly I will be with thee. The verse goes on, but I'm going to focus in on those. Certainly I will be with thee. God doesn't tell Moses, I want you to go do this now, good luck. I send Moses, I hear Pharaoh can be a hard nut to crack, so try your best persuasive tactics, Moses. Good luck with this. No, he tells him, you're going, but don't worry, I'm going too. The things that I'm going to be straightforward here. The things that God calls his people to do, when you really think about it, are terrifying things. And there's no nice way to put it, but it's true. God telling Moses, go back to Egypt where you ran for your life because Pharaoh wanted you dead. I want you to go back there and tell Pharaoh you're going to take his servants away from him. That's scary. This is not going to end well. Or God telling a man like Abraham to leave his home and just start walking until I tell you to stop. That's scary. God telling a man like Paul to take missions trips all around the known world to places where people wanted him dead. And it really hasn't changed a whole lot. God calling men to go to mission fields or start churches or pastor, for that matter, teach a Sunday school class. It's scary. Except one thing is always true. It's the same thing we find him telling Moses in verse 12. Certainly, I will be with thee. It doesn't have to be scary because God's there. So far in Moses' exile, we've seen God led Moses, God called Moses, and then lastly tonight, I want to see God prepared Moses. That's why God didn't call Moses to lead the people out with him when he left Egypt the first time. Not because they weren't ready, they were already afflicted. It was because Moses wasn't ready. Moses went through what would have been a difficult time, a rough time, while being exiled to the desert, but that time God was there, and God used that time to prepare Moses to lead the people. God prepared Moses spiritually. I'm not going to go long on this because I've already explained it some, but the people that God led Moses to, they helped him, or would have helped him to grow spiritually. When he left the first time, he wasn't in a place to be able to spiritually lead God's people. God used a low time in Moses' life to prepare him spiritually. Use it to prepare him mentally. His time in the desert would have humbled him. He went from being the grandson to Pharaoh, or of Pharaoh, to being nobody. It's really where he went. He went from, I am Pharaoh's grandson to I am a no one sitting by a well. He went from being in the Pharaoh's house and having the finest things to herding sheep. That's going to humble you. It's going to bring you down a notch or two, but that makes you realize that it's God who's doing the work and not you. Had Moses led them out the first time, it would have been easy to think it was by his ability, his knowledge, and not God. God used it to humble him, to realize that he needed God. God used it to prepare him physically. Now, I don't mean this totally as a joke, but God had him out there as a sheep herder, which isn't too much different than leading people around in a desert later. The Bible refers to us as sheep. Right. It prepared him for what he'd be doing for the rest of his life. And again, it prepared him to rely on God, to be able to admit that I can't do this on my own, that I need him. God sent him into the desert for a reason. There was a purpose. Now, for conclusion tonight, every one of us face low times. It's a fact of life. We all like the high times. We all like the times that everything is going right and going the way that we want it to. But life isn't always highlights. I'm a sports fan. Most of you know that. And I was listening to, a couple of weeks ago, to some old Hall of Fame football players who were talking about the guys who were being inducted into the Hall of Fame this year. And I can't remember who the guy was, but he was a defensive player, but he had made the comment that the best part of being in the Hall of Fame was that the only clips anyone showed of you from then on were your highlights. That was his big thing, that is the best part, is as soon as you're in the Hall of Fame, that's all they show is your good moments. He was a defensive guy, so he was saying, once you're in the Hall of Fame, no one played your missed tackles or your blown assignments or when you just plain messed up. They just showed your big hits and your interceptions and your big plays. And he made the statement, and I thought this was interesting, he made the statement, unfortunately, that's just not reality. Right. That was what he said, but that's what we would like our Christian life to be, is just the highlights. Unfortunately, that's not reality. We face some low times too, some times where, like Moses, we feel in exile. Where we feel like Moses, completely alone. But God has a reason for us being in the desert. I'll keep using my terrible rhyme, don't despair, God's there. He's still leading. He's still calling. He's still working in you. God has a purpose for the bad times, and God's still there. So as I wrap this up, the thought came to me, what do you do for an altar call for a message like this? And I really think it's pretty simple. Let's ask God to help us look for Him in the low times and realize He has a purpose for us being there. There's a reason. God's still working. Let's pray.